Okay, so this video is going to have a look at the theories that you could use in your media studies exams, and I'm going to point out which are probably the easiest to use and to remember, and also which ones are designated by the exam board as well. So we're going to start off with the ABC1 system. Now, if you've been somebody who has been following this spec for a while, so one of you teachers out there who's been with WJEC Educast from the beginning, then you'll know that this used to be known as the Acorn system in their textbooks, and you may see it still as the Acorn system if you're using some of the older textbooks, but we can use either acronym to explain this particular theory. So what this does is it breaks the audience down into categories depending on how much they earn. So it gives an indication to us, to companies, of what sort of disposable income that audience has to spend on products. So we go from A all the way through to E, with that C category being split into C1 and C2 because they tend to be the large or main audience that the population seems to make up. So right at the top we have the upper class. Now these are the highest earners. They have very high profile careers, so we might find people like high ranking managers, CEOs, company executives, owners, lawyers, doctors, all featuring in this particular category. The B category of this system tends to be the upper middle class, so people are very comfortable if they're in this particular category. They've got jobs that mean that they've got a very large disposable income, but they're not at the point that those on the A grade are. So they tend to be made up of middle managers and public service managers as well. Now our C1 and C2 are mostly middle class, middle to lower class. So in C1 we've got firmly middle class audience. The group are very comfortable, they've got enough to pay the bills, but they don't have a great deal of disposable income. So that would be people like your junior managers in industry or in public service, people like your teachers, police, those sort of people would be in C1. C2 are our lower middle class, so very little disposable income. They've got very secure jobs, but no way of really affording luxuries. So these are our skilled manual workers, carpenters, electricians. Even if they own their own company, are likely to be in the C2 grade. The D grade of this system is working class, so they've got very hard manual jobs, they work long hours and have just enough to pay for the essentials, so they tend to be unskilled manual workers. And our E level are unemployed, so they're not only unemployed but may have very poorly paid jobs, so they often don't have enough money to live on. So that could be people who are perhaps on low income casual workers, 0 hours contracts. It could also be people like yourselves, you know, young people who have their first job perhaps, okay, or even people who are retired. Now obviously this system is not definitive and it's not completely accurate, because somebody who is retired, for example, would be classed as an E grade on this system, but they may have enough money in their pension to be further up the system. People like teachers or police officers who are in the public service may fall into C1, but depending on what sort of promotions they take, might find themselves moving further up the scale. And obviously with things going on in the world such as pay freezes and things, it's not definitive, but it's a very easy system to use, particularly if you remember in your exam that every time you talk about audience you follow the sort of steps of age, gender, then where they are on this system, and that tends to be very useful then to get marks for using theory. Another simple theory that you can use, and you don't need to remember all of this, is the 4Cs system. This is the cross-cultural consumer categorization. So again, breaking our audience down, but instead the categories are based on personalities and social beliefs. You don't have to remember each of these steps on this theory, but one or two might be useful depending on which product you're looking at. So mainstreamers make up our largest group, and you could remember that one fairly easily to use in your exam. Now they tend to be domestic, so they conform to social norms, they're very conventional, they're sentimental, they want security, they like value for money, they like family brands. Aspirers, on the other hand, tend to be you guys. Young people who want status, who want material goods, who are concerned with their image, their appearance. Succeeders tend to be people from higher management. They're confident, they want control, they have a sort of goal-minded personality, very organised, work very hard. Whereas our resigned are mainly older people. They're interested in the past and the traditional values of the past. They seek to survive, but unlike our mainstreamers, they've got very rigid, authoritarian values. Explorers could also be you guys. Younger demographics, such as students, they have a focus on individuality, got more energy, they want new experiences, want to see new places. Strugglers is normally a lower demographic from low-income groups. They seek escape, generally by alcohol, junk food, lottery tickets, that sort of thing. They've got very few resources after their physical skills, which means they can be alienated and disorganised. And our reformers tend to be individuals with social awareness and independent judgment. They're anti-materialistic, but they do have good taste. Now again, when we think of this compared to the ABC1 system, it's not definitive, it's not completely accurate. Somebody or some organisation could fall into multiple parts of this system, but remembering one or two might be useful to help you out in your exams. Okay, Levi-Strauss then. So he created a theory called binary opposition, and this theory suggests that for a media product to be successful, it has to have a balance of opposites. Both of these opposites need to exist to make the product successful. So some examples could be a product containing both good and evil, or men and women, Labour and Conservative, rich and poor. So any product that exploits this uses this theory, and it's quite an easy theory to remember, but it's not one that's named by your exam board. Todorov, however, is one that's mentioned by the exam board. He suggested that all narratives follow the same pattern, which is made up of 5 stages. You can see it as an arc, and you could use this in English to help you out as well. The arc might not be as neat as the one that we've got here, but it will have all of these stages. So to start off with, we have this equilibrium, which is basically normal, everyday life as we know it. And then the disruption means that something happens to disrupt this normal everyday life. It puts things out of balance. Normally at the crisis point, which is at the top of the arc, we have recognition. Somebody wakes up and realises that something is wrong. They understand what needs to be done. And as we decrease the tension, go down that arc, the repair occurs. So steps are put in place to solve the problem or the issue. And eventually we end up with an equilibrium where either everything goes back to how it was before or a new normal is restored. So if you're looking at this in terms of a narrative or a story, it might not be as neat as this arc. It might have several sort of squiggly ups and downs, but you should be able to plot out each of these different steps. Now, if you would like me to show you how Todorov applies to modern, well-known narratives, let me know, because I can show you how this works for series as well as for individual narratives, just so you guys have got a better understanding of this. If you want that, just pop a comment down below and I will get that up for you. Okay, hypodermic needle model. So this theory is really long and a bit of a tongue twister to say, but it basically suggests that media has a really powerful effect on the audience. We can assume in this theory that the media has a direct impact on audiences by injecting messages into different media products, so sort of like subliminal messaging. And these messages that we see within a particular product can influence a large group of people by triggering a response. For example, if any of you caught the BBC documentary by Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall where it was called something like The War on Plastic, that's a really good example of how the media can have a direct impact on us as an audience. The message that was injected into that was that plastic is bad and we need to do something about it, and it can trigger quite a large response, as you may have seen yourselves. Hegemony then. Okay, so this theory was created by a guy called Antonio Gramsci. It's used to explain what happens when one social group takes over and dominates another. So there may be legitimate reasons why one group dominates another, or why it's represented as dominating another in the media, but you can use this term to explain it. For example, when we're looking at the Pride front cover, we could explain that it uses hegemony because it appeals directly to a particular audience. Pick and mix. David Gauntlet created this theory, so he sort of suggested that audiences are not as passive as suggested by the hypodermic needle model, that we don't just sit there and let ourselves get injected, and that instead we pick out parts of the text that suit our needs and throw the rest away, sort of ignore the rest. And that way the media that we watch can become more personal for us as a demographic. And that's very similar to this guy Stuart Hall, because he suggested that there are 3 different ways of reading a particular product. In the preferred reading, we take on board the message that the producers were hoping to put out, a bit like the hypodermic needle theory. In the negotiated reading, we can see what that preferred reading is, but we also form our own opinions, a bit like pick and mix. And then in the oppositional reading, we respond to the product in our own way. That might be completely disagreeing with the preferred reading, even if we recognise it. 2-step flow. So this theory is specific to news. You wouldn't really be able to use it for any other type of media. Step 1. The news is sent to people in power who are known as opinion leaders. And then in step 2, the leaders change and adapt the news, often in really tiny ways, before releasing that information to the audience through newspapers or television news or news websites. Now this allows companies to add and edit and adapt the bias within that news before it's consumed, which is why we see, if you go to Google and have a look at if you type in the papers, it'll take you to the BBC and you can have a look at all of the front pages. It's why we see the same story being repeated throughout different publications, but in slightly different ways. Barthes codes. Okay, so Roland Barthes created 5 different codes, and he suggests that for an audience to be interested in a media product, it must have at least one set of recognisable codes. And these codes can be broken down into different sections. So either we are interested in a media product because it has enigma codes, which create mystery and makes us want to solve something. It gives us something to focus on and to work out as we're consuming this text. Or it has action codes. So they help to keep the narrative moving really quickly, and so that we're engaged in it all the time because we don't have time to be bored. Semantic codes or meaning codes. We might be interested in a product because we can work out different meanings or narratives, and we can create social talking points from it because we agree or we disagree with what's being said. Or we might be interested in it because of the symbolic codes that are used. Things like intertextuality, where images and ideas stand for something that's a little bit larger or more important than what we take at face value. Or cultural codes, where we can see a representation of our own life, maybe through our religion or through the local area or through our age, perhaps, and that helps to keep us interested. Fiske's transparency fallacy. So this theory, again, mostly applies to news. Many people believe that news is a window on the world, whereby whatever we see on the TV is truthful. But Fiske's theory indicates that what's on the news is just a representation, and it's deliberately planned and constructed by producers. So this theory sort of works hand in hand with that 2-step flow model. Now, another theory that's specific to news are news values. Now, this was created by 2 theorists, Galtung and Rouge, who studied news stories and identified different values that could be attached to the story to give it more importance. The more values that are attached to a story, the more likely it is to be featured in a broadcast. So, competition. If a story, particularly one that's an exclusive story, is sought after by many journalists, it'll make it more popular. Composition means that the makeup and the order of the story and broadcast is important, because a story needs to fit in with other things around it in order for it to be relevant. Consonance is similar to composition. It needs to fit our expectations as well as everything else going on in the broadcast in order to be relevant. Conflict is one that you might want to remember, because again, this theory goes on forever, and you don't need to remember all of these, but one or two are going to be really useful when you're looking at the Sun or those two front pages. Conflict stories are very common because they divide opinion, so a story is going to be discussed more and therefore be more relevant. Continuity is basically a story that's already been in the news, a bit like Brexit, so we expect it to be reported on more regularly and we're likely to get updated throughout the process. Cooperation means that if one story is linked to another, then they'll both feature in the same broadcast. Whereas data is basically about verifying a story. If a story can be verified, it's less risky, so it's going to be given more priority to one that can't be verified. Elite nations and elite persons are again two terms that will be really useful to remember, even if you don't take away anything else from this theory, because they basically refer to any important country or important person. Anything or anyone that holds a lot of power is more likely to be featured in a broadcast. Familiarity, so if we're aware of a place or an event, if something's close to us, then it's going to be more popular. So that's really important for our local broadcasting companies. Frequency, a sudden story like breaking news will instantly be reported on and will saturate the news. Whereas logistics basically means the ease of reporting. So if it can be put together, if a story can be put together without too much effort or equipment, then it's more likely to be included. Meaningfulness is very similar to familiarity, but basically if we can relate or connect to the story, usually in an emotional way, then it's more likely to be reported on and it's more likely to be given more importance. Negativity, on the other hand, I mean, this is another one that's going to be used quite regularly, or that could be used quite regularly, because basically it means no news is good news. Negative stories attract attention, so they tend to get reported on more because they're more popular, and it means that we then form conflict and some of the other values that you've seen already. Personalisation. Basically, anything that... Personalisation is very similar to meaningfulness. So if an audience can find something personal within the story, normally an emotion, that means they resonate to the story or they have a connection to the story, then it's going to be more popular. Predictability is also something that you could use really easily in an exam, because basically this is if an audience expect a story, such as the Olympics, to be reported on, then it generally will be. Prefabrication, if a story takes less effort in terms of the manpower required to put it together, then it's going to be given greater importance. So it's very similar to data in a way. Now, time constraints is particularly important for television news, because if a channel suddenly needs to fill time or has a certain amount within its broadcast free, then that will decide the importance of the stories that can be included. Unambiguity is basically the easier that a story is to understand, the more likely it is to be reported on. And unexpectedness is if a story is strange or unusual, then it will be given more time and more importance because it's going to have a greater impact on the audience. Propp's characters. Okay, now this is another one that's mentioned by the exam board. So Vladimir Propp based a lot of this study on fairy tales, but basically it can be applied to virtually any kind of storyline, if you like, okay, or product, because it basically creates recognisable character types. So the hero is very often the protagonist or the main character within the story. He's usually sent out on a quest that needs to be solved. The villain is the opposite, the antagonist. He or she is designed to make the audience favour or side with the hero, generally by being bad or by being evil. The helper acts as a sidekick, and he or she assists the hero with their quest. Whereas the princess, or the prize, are the reward for the hero if he manages to complete his quest. To help the hero, a donor character will normally give an item or an object to help and assist with this quest. The princess's father is normally the person who gives the quest to the hero and who will reward him or her at the end. And the false hero is a character who's sometimes mistaken as the hero. They can appear regularly throughout. So again, if you would like me to do a singular video on Propp explaining these character types further by applying them to recognisable media, then just pop a comment down below. If you've got a TV show or narrative that you want me to apply it to in particular, then let me know and I will do a video on that for you as well. Okay, Laura Mulvey. Now this is a really useful theory and it can be really easy to include. She came up with two theories that work together. It's like one theory with two parts, and it explains how representations of different genders can help to position the audience. So in the male gaze part of the theory, it suggests that by representing women in a sexual way, the audience are put in the position of a heterosexual man or a straight man, so that we can understand the meaning behind the product. Whereas female gaze is the opposite. So the audience are positioned in the place of a heterosexual female when a man is represented sexually in order to gain the meaning and message of the product. Steve Neal. Okay, so he created a theory surrounding genre, and he claimed that a genre has to have repetition of conventions so that the audience can recognise what's happening and can anticipate events. So we would expect in a horror genre to find conventions such as darkness, isolation, blood, that sort of thing. But in order to keep us interested, genres have to also have some difference, and that helps to keep these genres evolving, which is why you tend to find films and things now have more than one genre applicable to them. Okay, now there's one other theory that I have to go through with you guys in this, but here are the key terms for this video. And finally, we have Blumler and Katz. Now, these guys are the most important theory for you to remember. If you remember no other theory, you have to remember this because it's likely to come up in one of the questions on your exam. So they came up with a theory that's called the uses and gratifications theory, or you might even see it as the theory of gratification. It doesn't matter what title you use as long as you understand it. And it's a really simple theory to understand. Basically, they suggested that we choose to watch media or consume media in order to be gratified. So we might watch a television programme to be informed, such as the news, or we might engage in a discussion over an episode of something to form a social talking point. We might want to be entertained. We might want to escape from our daily life by going to see a film. Or we might want to relate to the characters, events, situations, places, ages, religions that are being shown to us in that particular product. It's really important that you understand this theory because this is definitely going to come up somewhere in your exam. Okay, so these are the key terms from our look at theories today. So again, make them into note cards or however you want to use them. If you haven't already, please subscribe, hit the button down below, and if you click the little bell icon next to it, then you get instant notifications every time I post a video. And you can get in touch with me by leaving a comment down below or by getting in touch with me on Twitter @media_revision.